Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and you're listening to an episode of Astrologers in Profile. So this is a show that I've been doing for almost a year now. I guess I started it last August in 2018. And the show is dedicated to talking with astrologers and hearing a little bit about their story. Because a lot of the times we hear a lot from astrologers, teaching, or astrologers writing and sharing horoscopes or doing readings, but you don't always get behind the scenes to hear about the life of an astrologer or the path of a professional astrologer and what that looks like and how that affects us as astrologers, because astrology is really, in addition to being a profession, it's really a spiritual path. And a lot of us share that path, whether we're professionals or not. But I think this show has really been, this particular show that I do has been about trying to introduce people to the stories of astrologers. So that being said, I'm really happy to have Elodie here today. Elodie St-Onge-Aubut. I think I'm saying, she taught me how to say it because it's French. So at any rate, Elodie, thanks for being here. Really happy to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, actually, can you turn up your microphone a little bit?
Maybe I'll wear my earphone. I think that'll be best.
Yeah, I'll put mine on too.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Much better. Yeah.
Okay.
So, Elodie, I've met you. I think Elodie's a professional astrologer. I've met Elodie back in, I want to say like 2013 or something.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a webinar through Evolver that you were giving, and so I registered for that, and that was the first time I saw you speak. And then I think you were offering your first year class, and so I reached out to you because I was interested in learning with you.
Yeah, that's right. We went through several years of studying together in the group classes that I lead. But we'll get to that later. What I want to start with is the question that I think I've led with in almost all of these Astrologers in Profile episodes that I've ever done, which is, when did astrology start for you? Like how old were you? When did it first enter your life, or like what's your first memory of it?
I would say teenager. I discovered astro.com, and yeah, I think like a lot of teenagers, I was interested in the occult, tarot, and I Ching or I King. And yeah, so I knew the basic sun sign astrology for a long time, came across some books in the libraries. I was a real library mice when I was young, and so I would read all of the occult book they had in libraries, but it was always really pop culture-y. So my introduction to astrology was obviously through psychological, very cookbook type astrology. And yeah, I spent all of my teenage years being very involved with like the philosophy of Tibetan Buddhism. I was really into the imagery, and then eventually went to India when I was 24. I've always sort of followed that path, and then it just sort of deepened and eventually decided to study it full time. But it was always something that really occupied my mind.
I think that's such an important part of the story. Everyone says that. Everyone that I've spoken with on this show says at some point it really like sort of possessed me, or it really grabbed me, or it, kind of totally consumed me. What I'm always curious about is where the seeds had already been planted for that to happen. Like, were there any spiritual or religious elements in your upbringing, either positive or negative at all, that you see in the background of this story?
100%. I think a lot of the groundwork was laid out even before I was born. My parents were involved with Baha'i faith, and I was created, I think they were very enlightened by the principle of Baha'i faith when I was created, which is, I guess, the youngest religion. It's considered a religion. And the prophet comes from Iran. And basically, he took the philosophy of each religion. And I went to Baha'i school when I was young. I learned about Judaism, Christianity, Muslim. I learned about all of the prophet. And basically, it's about the unity of mankind and the importance of really ultimately seeing the humanity. And, he the prophet talks a lot about peace and stuff like that. So I grew up in that sort of space. My parents, my family, my uncles were all part of the Baha'i faith. It was not very cultish or anything like that. It was very, there was prayers, but there was this sort of spiritual, more enlightenment, I would say. It was not rigid or anything like that. My father, being a Pisces, is extremely sort of spiritual and sees the moment. Both of my parents are always followed sort of their true path. My dad is a guitar maker and my mom's a midwife. So in a sense, like I said, a lot of the groundwork was already there for me. I grew up in that space. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was really questioning society, what's around me, why is it like this, and really trying to find my own unique path since I came into my consciousness.
Yeah, wow. So my next door neighbor growing up, who I was really good friends with for a period of my youth, was of the Baha'i faith. And my father was a United Methodist minister, which is one of the more universal liberal denominations of Protestant Christianity. So we were, I grew up we were a very open-minded Christian family, but my next door neighbor, good friend, was Baha'i. And I always saw, I don't know if it was pictures of the prophet or not, but just the adornment of their home, the icons and things like that. It was so universal. And I always really just liked it felt like I was going into something maybe I was like, I shouldn't be, because, the Christian church is a little like of a cult itself, you know what I mean? But it was like, it felt like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. And I actually had a few clients over time, one in particular that I'm thinking of, who recently transitioned into the Baha'i faith. And yeah, he's just really loved the universal spirit of the tradition. But that's really interesting. And I mean, you couldn't get more sort of prepared for astrology than to be of a universalist faith background with a parent who's a guitar maker and another one that's a midwife. I mean, that's like,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. That's like a nice seed bed.
That's why I don't take all the credit for my path, because like I said, it was always sort of planted. Now, if you think that there's a sort of continuity to the soul, then I'm just continuing work, and chose these circumstances. But in a sense, it was I never felt like I was blocked by my upbringing. It was always, I was very nurtured like a flower, They always cultivated or put emphasis on cultivating like what is really important, which is following what I want to do. So they were never sort of resisting who I was becoming, which I think is really important. And also acceptance when it comes to Baha'i faith, acceptance of all humankind, in a sense, I think really gave me ahead of the game in regards to when you do astrology, you meet all sorts of people, you realize that everybody suffers, everybody has their struggle. And even though each chart are very different, ultimately you can really see the humanity behind people, behind their chart. And I think for me, that's sort of, there's something non-judgmental about the Baha'i faith. And I think there's something non-judgmental about approaching clients, approaching natal astrology. You have to be very non-judgmental about characters, about people, and just seeing the humanity in the struggle and everybody.
There's something about the birth chart that says, like, to everybody, there's going to be some ups and there's going to be some downs, and that's true sort of for everybody, and every birth chart shows it. But underneath, there's also this there's the humanity that we all share in, the world soul, and there's also this idea that there's a soul behind all of these ups and downs, and that seems to play very naturally into a number of different religious or spiritual traditions. So it's not surprising that so many different faith paths have accepted astrology in some form or another. Hindu, Buddhist, Islam, Christianity, all the different ones that you mentioned as having studied in the Baha'i faith as well. I think that there's been some basic acceptance of astrology, even though the Christian church today doesn't really embrace it like they did a long time ago. there's still, I think, the same thing that you're saying about seeing the soul in the world, seeing the soul in everybody, and noticing that everyone goes through ups and downs, like very basically that fits into some of the values of a lot of different spiritual paradigms.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like I have some characteristic, lower characteristic, I would say, about like, let's say, envying somebody because they have like certain space in the world or whatever. But then I always return to the fact that like I think, yes, there's a lot of inequality in the world, but I think behind that, everybody suffers,
Mhm.
and I don't think that like the material reality, in a sense, can be a good uh, example of what people are truly going through. So, material success or anything like that is just so ephemeral behind, like, in regards to actually what we're here doing.
Yeah, there's I was at Norwalk. I think you might have been at Norwalk this time that I was there too, and there was someone doing paintings of your birth chart. Do you remember that?
Yep, I remember her. She was from Europe somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I ordered one for my wife and myself, not the huge ones, but smaller ones, and she did them, and they were so beautiful. And it helped me to see. So this, just so that this makes sense. There was a woman who was doing sort of impressionistic paintings of your birth chart. And so she would sort of put your chart in a painting and then surround it with different moods and images that sort of reflected your chart, it was really cool. So at any rate, after I got these and I spent time looking at my chart in this painting, sat in my office for a while. I was struck by the way in which all of my ups and downs were actually in life, were actually artwork. That there was a beauty and a meaningfulness behind it, and that helped me also in terms of dealing with some of the envy. Dealing with some of the comparison. Oh, this placement in my chart's rough, or this placement, and I think that's so that what you just said about helping you get beyond envy, and helping you realize that there's a deeper level of the chart tells us one thing, but really it's also giving us this language to interact with, and knowing something of the language of astrology, we can um, shift our consciousness in relationship to the events of our life or our destiny, and that, of course, for each of us can provide us with a happiness and beauty in our life. It sort of transcends the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also the role of spirituality. So if you're a spiritual person and you combine astrology with it, it really helps you sort of step away from your own character and your own downfall.
Yeah, 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 totally. Here's a question for you. So when you were, I guess, many people may not know this about you, but one of the things that's been kind of cool about Elodie's path is that Elodie has, for a long time, I don't know how long it's been, you've been someone who has lived mostly off grid. So maybe tell us about how astrology has woven its way into living in kind of a non-traditional setting, and maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been off grid for 15 years actually.
What does
So
that
I met
mean? Sorry, tell us what that
off
means.
grid. That means producing off grid. The grid is the electrical grid basically. So I think it's a sort of nickname slang for not being on the electrical grid. So producing our own electricity basically. But then the range of off grid can be so many things. I mean, some people are off grid and they don't have running water. Some people have a farm. I think off grid has like this romantic romantic vibe for people in the
Yeah, yeah,
collective psyche. People are like, ah, off grid, it's so perfect, so peaceful, and all of that.
yeah, yeah.
um there's a price to pay for everything.
Of course.
uh but basically in 2004 I met someone from Newfoundland. I had never even heard of Newfoundland. Newfoundland is an island in the North Atlantic. It's the most easterly point of the continent. So I met somebody, I was cooking for tree planting camps, which is camps in northern Canada where there's reforestation, and I was feeding the workers there in a very isolated region. And I met a Newfoundlander and we fell in love. We went to India together for 4 months because I was heading there anyway.
Nice.
And then he said, "Oh, I'll come with you." He had never actually traveled outside of Canada, so I think it was a bit of a shock for him.
Right.
And then and then eventually we bought a cabin here in Newfoundland and decided to live here full time. So I spent most of my 20s without running water and electricity in a very isolated part of Newfoundland. No access to the internet, anything like that. And then relocated in a more countryside setting and have been here for 8 years, off grid also, but we have a well, we have solar panel, we're all very comfortable. But my 20s were spent with an outhouse outside, going out in the winter, snowstorms, anything, getting water at the lake, filling buckets, boiling water in the winter, like a very simple existence. I was working in the summer on camps, and then I would spend my winter in the cabin. That's how I was able to do it. But also no expense because not paying rent, not paying electricity and stuff like that. And I spent most of my 20s living this way, learning about self-sufficiency, hunting, harvesting, anything, foraging, putting snares, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's so, first of all, it's so interesting that you've done that you've had the chance to learn about yourself and about the universe and about nature in that setting. You're right that it is romantic in the eyes of people who have never done it, I'm sure, because, well, just in my brief experience, being a backpacker and being, let's say like backpacking for 10 days away from that setting, it's everything is effort, everything is work. And I'm, so I just can't even imagine what it would be like to do that for years on end through the elements, like everything. So I can only think about it in that way. But the other thing that came to my mind is this, I think it was a book that came out by, I'm forgetting his name, John Krakauer, I think that's his name. But he wrote this book called Into the Wild. Have you heard of that book before?
Of course I have, yeah.
Right. So I'm
Yeah.
sure you've heard the comparison before. And in the book, this young man, Chris, I forget what his name was, but he was played in a movie that they did, a movie version of it. And I remember because Pearl Jam did the soundtrack. I think it was really nice.
It was good, yeah.
Yeah. But, he kind of had this same idea of like, I'm going to go off grid, had no idea what he was doing sort of in some ways, and other ways maybe he had prepared, but and he ended up dying. And the film was sort of about that, like the untamed spirit of youth that wants to explore and like separate from, the kind of the evils of society, but also like the wildness and danger of nature. That you must have had many experiences that were similar, where you felt over your head, or you felt like, like, what am I doing? Or, how did you deal with, I guess, moving through the romanticism and into the reality of it?
Well, it happened slowly because what I did for a living for a very long time is cook in remote bush camps all over Canada. So I was familiar with just like working generator and being stuck in the wild and dealing with bears and stuff like that. So it sort of happened gradually. I didn't really have this romantic notion as much by the time we bought our cabin in the woods. And my partner at the time, who was from Newfoundland, was already like a seasoned salmon fisherman. He knew a lot of the wild here already because it's sort of part of the culture here in Newfoundland still. It's very wild. And so I had a really good guide.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would have been able to do it by myself because I was living in Montreal before. But I think just learning astrology and learning about myself through time, I've found that this is for me the best way to channel some of my natal placement. Having Mars rising in Scorpio, I need to feel self-sufficient, And if I don't exert power, like you said, being in the power presence of nature and these very life or death circumstance, then that gets channeled really badly in my
Mm,
relationship, and it just sort of manifests in a negative way. So once I started really learning astrology and learning about myself, I'm like, this is perfect for me. I knew instinctively, but now that I know that asserting my physical strength on a daily basis and working really hard to exist is actually the best way to channel some of the stuff I have going on in my chart. Um,
mm.
yeah, so in a sense, since I have learned astrology more, I've actually just accepted my existence a lot more too,
You
because
know,
it sort of happened. Sorry.
no,
Yeah.
no, that's yeah, that's you're yeah, this is so wonderful. So, yeah, I mean that's such a nice observation. I'm thinking, for example, in our birth charts, we have different planetary placements, and it's not as though every single environment is preordained or destined. We have some choice over what we do and what we surround ourselves with. In fact, the Bhagavad Gita makes it very clear that that's one of the primary uses of our freedom is to choose what kind of environment we want to be in. And the environment is more or less conducive to, a state of peace or happiness. And if you have a Mars in the first house, like I was just thinking about when I first met you at the retreat center in in person when we met for the first time when we were doing the retreat, which was in upstate New York. I mean, you were in the kitchen, like wielding a blade, like a lot. If I, like you were, you were near like the heat and the pots and I'm just thinking about how, if you have Mars in the first house, you like you'd be very happy like carrying an axe around or having a knife on you, like just think
and
like
and feeling powerful,
yeah,
actually. Yeah.
yeah,
And talking about carrying a knife, I'll just show you quickly, because this is I always have a little
that's right,
knife.
that's right, that's right.
um but now that I know astrology, I actually go out of my way to find sort of this positive ways to make me feel good, because
Yeah, it's
before that, Mars rising was actually problematic in my early 20s, when I was not in a surrounding that was conducive to feeling powerful.
yeah, yeah, you put that in a city, it's a lot different than, I mean,
It's
wielding an
Yeah.
axe in the city is a little different than being out in the land.
Yeah, and I think I think that Mars rising wants to I like to work hard. And if I didn't know astrology, I don't know. I think I might have been more resistant to working hard. I work in kitchens, very long hours. It's difficult on the body and stuff. But I think part of my makeup is that I need to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's like they say when I went through this when we were thinking about getting a dog, which is that, the different dogs need different kinds of environments in order to really be happy because of how they've been bred for so long. And I had this realization. I'm like, humans aren't different. Like look at the rising sign and it's really telling you something about the environment and what it needs to be like for this plant of the soul to sort of thrive. It's a really wise insight. So, you're out there. How does astrology come into the picture while you're out, basically in the woods, so to speak?
Um, mm, mm, mm. Well, I think it gives me more time to study and contemplate, because as much as I do that, astrology is it's sort of like never-ending path. And so living in this way actually gives me a lot more time for studying, reflecting, writing, contemplating, which is really important, I think. Well, it's important for me. So if anything, obviously a lot of my daily routine takes a lot of my time, but because I don't need to be in the hustle and bustle like we had talked before, then I have more time for contemplation and study, which is really primarily for me. Astrology is primarily just research and study, and I don't think it's something I'll ever conclude.
Mhm. Right. So in that sense, you're like hermit woodswoman.
But I'm a lady of the world also. I really like socializing, and I have astrology meetups here in town. No, I'm not so deep in the wood as I was in my 20s. Here I'm more in the countryside. We're still off grid, but the city is not that far, which is a good happy medium. It's nice. But I'm still self-sufficient, which is very important to me.
Yeah.
And just to go back a little bit to remediating with the birth chart, I use that a lot with clients, actually, just finding activities that that's something I wanted to say earlier when we were talking about it. Just like finding activities that are in line with people's chart. I feel like that, in enacting them, I feel like that's one of the best remediation for people. So I just wanted to put that in. You know, like
Nice.
carrying a knife. I work with a girl who's a baker also and has Mars rising in Cancer. And I was like, you need to start carrying a knife. Just, and like little things. Just
You're the knife
like,
distributor.
yeah, the knife distributor. Yeah, and I mean, there's just Anyways, I think basically astrology is sort of like an instruction manual to how you can optimize what you're born with, what you have like in your toolbox.
Here's another question for you, and this is sort of what I meant by the last question. It wasn't asked very clearly. How did astrological studies come into your life in the first place while you were out there? Like, how was your interest in astrology growing while you were so removed from society for a while?
Okay, well, I was always interested in divination, always, and I use nature to divine all the time. This is something sort of like I was born with, or I think we all do. I think all humans have a tendency to divine their surrounding, but some people do it more. So I would see a certain bird and I would be like, okay, today's going to be like this, find a certain rock. I would always sort of divine with what's around me. And obviously I was always interested in more complex divination systems. So I think that astrology just really enrich this diviner eye. When you have a tendency for divination, I feel like astrology is one of the most complex divination system. I know not everybody likes to say astrology is a divination system, but it's a very complex divination system, and it really helps you divine the time. And so, yeah, in a sense, I
So that's
think
kind of what led into it, was being out there in
just being in
nature.
nature and in the natural rhythm of things, and then it just adds a layer of complexity, really.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think we are missing right now, when I was in graduate school, I lived in a little cottage. It was on the grid, but it was out in the country, and it was on 80 acres, right? So I had a lot of, when I wrote my first book, I was basically secluded and trying to get clean from drugs or some addiction. And while I was out there, one of the things that I noticed, and I'm sure you had the chance to notice this at a much deeper and more extended level being there for so long, but I noticed that with those rhythms, whether it's just the lack of noise or the lack of light pollution, and just the way that you can see and feel the rhythms, the sounds, the birds are really active at some times, then they die down, then they're active again. I mean, all of those different things that you see and feel. And then when something really stands out, when a ruckus happens, or a bird appears in a location that it's not usually in, or something stands out, it's much easier to notice. Whereas I feel like here, I live in the suburbs of DC, I lived in New York City, like in these settings, I really don't feel close to that anymore, where I can't really tell if something's standing out because everything is sort of a blur. It's moving fast. It's all sort of programmed, automated. So I feel like one of the things I'm hoping to do is the retreat that Elodie had came on years ago was a divination retreat with Jeffrey Cornelius, who sort of, if you haven't read his book, The Moment of Astrology, read it, because it's an amazing book about astrology as divination. And I think everyone needs to have some time to study astrology next to natural forms of divination, being out in nature and looking for, just being present to what might speak. Because I think that's actually the oldest form of divination on the planet that astrology sort of grows out of. So I can only imagine, Elodie, that would have been a really rich environment to kind of, really start growing your craft.
Yeah, 100%. I think nature is medicine for everybody. I like to think, especially for me. And when I lived in Montreal in my early 20s, I was the most miserable person in the world. I was very into existentialist literature, like Jean-Paul Sartre and those French
Right.
literature. And when
Like
I was
titles like Being and Nothingness.
Yes, exactly. And because I was certain of my friend, we would like sort of indulge in that sort of thinking. And I was with somebody who considered himself a nihilist. And I was living in the industrial sort of
What
space.
what did the knife look like at that point? I'm just kidding.
It looked like getting drunk and punching people in the face.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, or biting. Uh, yeah.
I love that story. Sorry, it's an old story Elodie told one time. Yeah.
A lot of people who love me know about that story. And so yeah, and then I met my ex-partner, moved to Newfoundland, and started living in nature. And I realized, because when I was in Montreal, I remember having lunch with my mom one day, who came visit me, and I said, I don't know what to do with my life. I don't want to participate in this. I'm just so lost. And I was just so lost. I could not find meaning. And then as soon as I moved to nature, I was like, oh, it's not complicated at all. I'm not even searching now. This is just what I needed.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people are looking and searching, especially in your 20s, you're looking and searching. But nature just sort of brings you back to your real rhythm, sort of anchors you, especially if you have a lot of earth and, Taurus in your chart and stuff like that. You just need to feel that connectedness, and then it's not complicated. It's like meditation. It's like once you meditate, you just stop complicating everything, and you're just there in the present moment, where you can make better decisions for yourself. So for me, I think nature at this point in my life, it's sort of it's my medicine, and I know, and so I make it my priority to be in that rhythm, because I know how low I can get if I'm not in that rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people, it's like that. And we are so adaptive as creature that we forget how unnatural it is to be in a big city in this crazy rhythm. When I was in Montreal, first when I moved there, I was like, how can people live here? And after a year or two, I was completely adapted. I didn't hear the noise. I didn't notice the smell, how bad it smelled and stuff like that. So we adapt to whatever environment, which is great, but it's also really bad.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about there was a time when my wife she's an herbalist, and so my wife would just Ashley, she would love this conversation. But yeah, there's something about being in nature that and my wife and I were just reflecting on this recently together. There's something about being in nature that sometimes it's romanticized in two different directions. One is like, oh, it's this amazing thing, and then you get there and it's like, oh, it's kind of tooth and nail. It's actually difficult to figure out how to survive. And then I think on the other end, there's another fantasy, and I've seen it in film too, like a lot of survival films, right? And they get really, really existential. They're like, once you're in nature, like there's no meaning. It's just, survival, and it's brutal, and it's just a void of nature. And people also go to this extreme to be like, nature is just this vacuum of hunger or something. And well, I think it's this very similar dichotomy that comes up with birth charts, right? Either people think, their lives are basically, pointless, and they need to enlighten out of here. Or they think, they're totally enmeshed in their life in this way, thinking that all of these things are going to give them meaning. And I find that a lot of times people are approaching the spirituality of astrology from one of those two extremes. So I have two types of clients. I have clients that are like, tell me how to use my chart to get enlightened, basically. Or I have clients that are like, tell me how to get a lot of money or how to get a better job. you know, and
Just in the material.
yeah, in a material sense, just like, how do I
Yeah.
get stuff? How do I avoid stuff? And it feels to me every time I go into nature, it feels like those extremes go away. If I'm there for a while, those extremes go away, and there's more of an ebb and flow. There's more of a balance, and what's important presents itself, whether it's spiritual or material, and they have a way of going together and being joined together more.
Yeah, and when you're actually in nature, like participating, let's say to daily life and just harvesting stuff, and you don't have that much time to think.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? You're naturally more in the present moment because you're having a garden, you have to transplant some things, you have to pump water, you have to take care of the animals, whatever it is. It's just more conducive to being in the moment. And I think that's the sort of maybe romanticized nostalgic idea that some people have about the off grid, and also about the past when life was simpler.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're working from sunrise to sunset, you don't really have time to contemplate philosophical existentialist question. You're just doing,
You're just doing.
surviving, making soup, growing your food, hunting, being very close to life and death and those cycles, which I think we need as humans. So I'm not anti-evolution, and I think,
Where does the contemplation come in there? Like when you're, because I mean, I know you're working a lot, but clearly for you, you did find time for divination, for astrology. I mean, you're an astrologer who's still sort of living in that setting somehow. So somehow contemplation comes in, right?
absolutely. I mean, that's the first thing I do when I wake up in
Winter.
the morning. Winter also, yeah, winter, absolutely. But I mean, like in the morning before getting online and doing my emails and stuff like that, I'm gonna spend an hour in the woods just to completely like regroup.
Hmm.
I'm just there. I'm listening to my surrounding. I'm connecting. I'm, I guess, a polytheist in a sense. I just really feel everything that surrounds me has a consciousness in a sense, and I just pay attention. Okay, the wind is coming from the south today, what is it carrying? And just sort of being part of the space and bringing down my ego into this more sort of, I'm just participating to my surroundings. I'm not better than the surrounding, or and
Hmm.
I've been thinking about that a lot because I forage, but I always forage just enough for what I need for the day. When I started foraging 20 years ago, I would like fill, make so many mason jar, get all the mushroom, all of this. And I see the trend here, foraging is very trendy right now. And people, they just want to get a lot, a lot, a lot. And I remember being in that space, and yeah, I was just thinking about how I don't need to. I'm just like, I just see myself sort of as like a little animal in nature, and I'm just like, eat. Like right now, there's a lot of nettle. Do I need all the nettle? No, I just need the nettle that's growing right now because it's growing right now to fortify myself and stuff. I don't need to do like 20 jars of nettle pesto. Um, so it's sort of like participating in that rhythm.
Yeah, there's no there's foraging, but it's not the same as hoarding.
Yeah, but I think that our society pushes us to gather, gather, gather,
Yeah.
and maybe also like, yeah, I don't know, we're always in this sort of I think excess, we go to
Hmm.
the there's just so much excess and everything, and it's sort of why we're in that situation. um
Right.
and I feel like I sound like a hippie, but I don't. And I've been called a hippie all my life, but I'm not really a hippie. I just like to consider that I'm participating. I'm trying to participate the best as I can without, and I think simplicity is definitely one of the best way to participate.
Hmm.
When you're existing, when you're a human, when you wonder, what's happening with this system, what's happening with the overconsumption. Well, the best thing you can do is actually just simplify.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really nice. And so, how does this lifestyle and this world that you've been in, that astrology sort of grew up through, how does it express itself when you meet with people? Like, how does this world inform the way that you read charts for people? Or what are some of the things that are really important for you when you read or do astrology for others because of this background?
Um, so where I'm at now, I think in the way I see this is that I just like to shape myself as a whole sort of holistic individual. So that means, you know, being a well-rounded individual for me means understanding astrology, understanding the wisdom of time, understanding the omens of nature, but whatever. And so in that sense, I'm bringing this to others in consultation. And when I'm sitting down with somebody, I guess I'm really a lot about remediation if somebody's struggling, but remediation in regards to arranging your life in the ways that sort of vibes with your chart.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I don't know. It's just like a way of existing for me. It's just just as much as like exercising and eating healthy and meditating. Like my astrology practice is just sort of part of that in a sense. I don't really know how to explain it. When I'm meeting with somebody, I guess I'm bringing all of that wisdom and experience with me, and
I mean,
it's
how many,
just
yeah, I was going to say how many other astrologers are probably spending that much time in a place of listening, in a place of nature, not a lot. And that brings something, that brings your vision of the chart, and your ability to read for people is informed by that space that you live in. It's not different probably from older generations of astrologers who were somewhat more monastic.
yeah, that's how I see it, and that's exactly you said it exactly. I think people come to me because they are actually looking for that informed experience. A lot of people that come to me already sort of know that that's what I do. A lot of contemplation, a lot of research, a lot of books, a lot of experimentation by myself in nature. So I think, you know, I'm not sort of the astrologer who help people make better business decision.
Right, right.
I I like to bring non-judgment to people, and I think just by who you are, so it sort of like reflects back, and so the conversation established with the other person, and they sort of feel that energetically. Then what arises from the reading,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, but I also always try to put the power back into people's hands. So when they come to see me, I empower them with their own chart in a sense that I say, this is your territory. I can only translate the language for you, but you have to make the effort of self-reflection yourself. And the answer is, I'm not in a position to give you an answer. I can only help you translate your chart. And
Mm-hmm.
so this in a sense is conflicting for me because I'm more interested in teaching and mentoring people who have that curiosity about their chart, because I don't like being in a position where I'm just giving answers to people who just want to answer and they're not really interested in actually making that self-reflection. It's hard for me. It's sort of conflicting. I don't like that dynamic very much. Obviously I do it, but I'm a lot more interested in just really helping people upgrade with the language, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so you continue to learn and study, read books. I know you were taking courses. You took mine at one point. I know you've studied in many different ways from quite a few different people by now. But the other thing that I'm wondering about is at some point, and I remember earlier on when you were in my class, you were talking about the struggle to sort of get yourself to go into the city more regularly to build your practice. And at some point you started doing that. You started branching out more. You've done a lot now. You've been on your local television programs. I mean, there's been a lot of different things that you've done. Can you just take us through how you came into the professional practice?
Yeah, I think I had to actually make the effort of quieting that voice that wants to resist not participating. And I'll actually sort of develop a relationship with the Capricorn side of me.
Right, right.
And just be like, it's okay, because I'm not going to sacrifice myself at the altar of astrology just to be of service and then not eat,
Right.
So obviously, yeah, I just put myself out there. I did a business plan and I just went all like CEO.
Right. That's that
And
Mars is helpful for that too, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. And I made peace with some misconception about like participating in society and stuff like that, because I think, you know, we have to participate. It's just, there's something about astrology that is so sacred that's really hard to market. That's for me personally. It's just, I find it difficult to just put myself out there and offer like 2-for-1 readings and stuff like that. The other thing is, when I started studying with you, I had this sort of vision that I still continue to see, which is, I'm practicing astrology, I'm becoming better, and eventually it will just completely flourish into what it's supposed to be, and I trust the growth process of it. And because of that, I don't know, opportunities just naturally come when I'm ready for them, and there's just like a natural sort of incline. I think that this is definitely the path that I'm supposed to be on. I don't have any doubt in my mind. I'm still cooking. Sometimes I'm doing like part-time baking and stuff like that, because I'm not willing to sacrifice my practice. Like, I guess. I just trust the natural sort of evolution that it's taking. People are knowing about me more and more. Here in town, I think a lot of people know about me already. So opportunities, there's like an exponential growth that happens naturally with it. So yeah, like I said, I'm just building myself as an individual, and it's happening in the process.
It must be reassuring. I mean, one thing again that I would say, my experience is vastly different from yours. Like, you know, sort of training wheels version of being out in nature. But a couple of years that I lived in the country on my grandfather's land in this little cottage, I was also helping my grandfather with his gardens and planting and things like that. He had a Christmas tree farm, and one of the things that I remember while I was studying Amazonian shamanism during that time and going down to the Amazon and stuff like that was just being impressed by this idea that you can, you know, trusting your path, especially when you've had it becomes natural to trust your path. What I'm trying to say is it becomes natural to trust your path when you've seen nature develop and grow on its own. Like you're watching trees, you're watching gardens, you're watching plant cycles, you're watching all this stuff. You're watching even like mushrooms, because in Michigan, it's very popular to go hunting for morels. I'm sure you know those. So they just pop up, you know. It's like, where do they come from? They just appear. And so I think seeing those things, nature also has a way of teaching us to just trust that your development doesn't actually need you to create a vision board every 10 minutes.
Yeah, and we're
You
such
know.
in a hurry in this, and I get caught up by the virus all the time. Anyways, also, I'm doing really good this year, but there's ebbs and flows where sometimes I'm just like, oh my God, you know, questioning my situation. But ultimately, deep down, I want to be in that space where I just trust the process. And if that requires me to do other type of work, then I'll do other type of work, because astrology is not sort of work for me, you know, like, even though it is becoming, but I don't want to get disgusted with my practice because I'm scheduling too many people and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And I have that privilege because I decided consciously to not have that many bills, to not, you know, I made different type of sacrifice to allow this natural growth to take place. It's not like, oh, I just want this natural, you know, it sounds idealistic. But obviously I'm taking a lot of sacrifice in order to actually leave that opening
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
happen naturally. And obviously I have like a good friend of mine who studied psychology. She started studying psychology when I started studying astrology full time with you, and now she's graduated, she's a doctor of psychology, and she's rolling in dough. And I'm looking at myself and I'm like, yeah, okay.
Right.
I feel like I still have a long path ahead. It's not something that I see an end to. The sort of making money and having clients and having a practice is something that comes with it, but it's not my ultimate goal with astrology. like I said, I'm a researcher. I'm interested in learning more. I want to eventually go into Vedic and write. And so, you know, I'll make the sacrifice necessary to keep that sort of ecosystem going
Yeah,
as long
yeah.
as I can.
Of course. And so, yeah, it takes tending. You have to make the environment right so that the right kind
Yeah.
of things will grow. And that takes, yeah, it takes some tending and sacrifice. And, you know, you can't, you have to put a little bit of blood on the plants of astrology for them to grow, you know?
Yeah. And
There's a,
it sounds very utopian in a sense, and it is. I think it's not it's not a practical way to set myself up. Obviously I'm almost 40, you know, and I'm baking, and it's very hard physically and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things around it that doesn't is not that it's not that glamorous, but I feel in my heart that this is what I'm supposed to be doing against the tide of commercialism and Instagram and YouTube and everything that I could potentially do to market myself and be successful. I feel in my heart that this is my path.
yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's obviously as someone who's a little bit more looped into that, you know, in the suburbs with the family, the yoga studio, the whole thing.
It's
Um,
beautiful.
well,
I think it's great, and you've given me so many opportunity also. So obviously, like just the opportunity to be talking to you today also. So you've always served like the role of a mentor.
oh, well, that's yeah. I like to see people who are awesome do better at what they're awesome at. So if I can
Thank
help, that's yeah. Um,
you.
you know, the thing that I'm coming back to is this idea of when you're in the space that you know, this idea that astrology takes sacrifice. That was really, I really like that point, because a lot of times people also, they like astrology, they're drawn to it, and they want to take a class and get a certification, which a lot of different teachers provide, and then they want to, you know, immediately dive into like being an astrologer. And in the same thing in the yoga industry, it's like, well, take a yoga teacher training and it's that. You posted something not long ago that you said astrology is the new yoga, and you were being sarcastic and funny. But it was, as someone who's been a yoga studio owner for a decade almost, I was like, that is so totally true. In the yoga industry, astrology has become more acceptable as a regular kind of thing that yoga studios will offer, or classes and workshops that they'll provide. You're getting your chart done in classes. Like it's very, very common now, I think more so than it was even a decade ago, for people who are into yoga from a more mainstream perspective, like let's say more of physical exercise and relaxation, to start bridging over into this kind of psychological chart evaluation. Like, well, plug into me. Like, what do the stars say about me? And in that way, like yoga has always, and I think now astrology as well, are sort of like gateway drugs. So I have mixed feelings about the way that they're being presented in that way, because on the one hand, you know, you have a lot of YouTube astrologers, or a lot of, you know, just a lot of popular astrology content out there like yoga that is kind of materialistic and commercialized, really. But for many people, including myself, who first walked through some of those doorways, I just kept going, and then I found some of the real wells that I could draw from. So I'm curious to know how you feel about that level of compromise, because obviously you walk that path, or that bridge between something that in a sense is a little bit more monastic, or I don't want to say pure in some really idealistic sense, but it is a little bit more pure, which are the life that you live, and the perspective of the universe that you get living a little bit more off the commercialized grid. And you've had a chance to also see astrology from that perspective, and the whole industry from that perspective. So I'm just really curious to hear you say more about that.
Yeah, I think I don't really. I sometimes I have problems with it depending on what I see and stuff. But overall, I think it's just it's good that a lot of people are exposed to language. I think, it's an upgrade when you know astrology. And like you said, I think that people will naturally eventually continue or not, or do what they need to do with it. There's this sort of intelligence behind things that protect them, that
Mhm.
protects this, if you're a seeker, then the doors slowly continue opening and that's it. So it's fine, and a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon, and that's fine. It's not a comfortable place for me, but I don't judge, or I try not to judge people that are choosing different paths with it. I think
Mhm.
it's like anything in life. It's complicated. It's a complicated sort of. It's not black and white.
That's right.
Um,
It's a really good perspective to have. It's not as though I'm impressed that you have that perspective, because I think it would be easy to imagine that someone with your perspective could be really jaded. Like, well, look at the, like, you could get into astrology and then realize that it's also in a way this kind of commercialized industry, and then be like, well, screw this. But you've found some ability to live with and tolerate that. And I wonder if that doesn't kind of come back to your faith, your Baha'i faith that we started with, which in a sense keeps you non-judgmental and seeing the humanity in everyone and in everything.
I can be really judgmental sometimes, but
Still have the blade, but yeah.
but I think ultimately, I'm not in a space where I'm trying to monopolize and capitalize on my practice. Therefore, I'm not in a space where I'm like, oh, well, these people are successful, and look, I've been investing like 7 years and thousands of dollars on my study, and I'm actually not making such a great living as this 21-year-old creating memes on Instagram. But I'm not in this. But I'm not in that space, because I'm not in a space where I'm actually like trying to make a living. That's why I'm cooking on the side. I don't want to be in that desperate
Hmm.
space where I'm like, oh, but my astrology is superior or anything like that. Um, I'm just totally intrigued by astrology, and I'm always in a state of observation with it. We can never draw a hard conclusion with astrology,
Hmm.
So while I'm learning astrology, I'm observing how that is manifesting in the public and for myself and stuff like that. I think if I was in a space that I was trying to capitalize on my practice, maybe these things would bother me more. But because I'm totally sort of in my I'm totally in my tower studying, it's not really it. And obviously I'm interested in education, so every opportunity I have when I'm hanging out with millennials who are learning from memes and who are learning the chart without reading the wheel gives me an opportunity to teach.
Right, of
so
course.
every time so every time there's people that are misguided by the popular culture movement, it gives me an opportunity to teach. So
Yeah.
I'm actually really yeah, I don't have an issue with it or anything like that. um at work, I work with a lot of millennials who are into astrology and are completely misguided, and it's always a super great opportunity for me. So yeah.
Yeah, that is an issue, and we were joking. I was like, I had that. I think I posted a, what do they call them? A GIF on your page at one point that was like, "Get off my lawn."
Yeah,
But I
and I like joking about it.
no,
Like I like joking.
I feel that way too. I have Norwalk this year. There was more than, I think, probably close to half. I'm just doing this in my head, obviously. Like half of the participants in a sold out Norwalk, I think sold out for the first time. This is the Northwest Regional Astrology Conference in Seattle. And I think more than half of the attendees were like younger, like probably millennials. I don't even know what officially defines a millennial. I might be a millennial. I don't know. Um,
1980s millennial, I believe.
yeah, 81. So I guess you could call me a millennial. Um, I like, my wife and I debate about this because she's 79 and supposedly I think that's like the cusp. And at any rate, I'm like, look, you know, I'm not a millennial, damn it.
how
But
did how did being a millennial become an insult too? That's the other thing.
well, I think it comes like, for example, my in-laws love to slam millennials all the time. And I I find that it's probably a recurring generational theme.
Yeah,
Like it's just like one
exactly.
generation as they're kind of coming into adulthood starts looking at the 20-year-olds and being like, man, I'm done with that grade level, like, but
Yeah,
so I
exactly.
think people just
Yeah.
do that. But
But to
yeah.
return to your, just briefly to return to the comment about like or your question about like the zeitgeist, the current zeitgeist of
Mhm.
astrology and the social media and stuff, I like to poke at it, but in the moment, if I see something stupid, I'll call it out and then I'll just move on. It's not, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like my Cancer and I don't know what else in my chart. I'm always, I'm always hesitant to nowadays to get involved with the really, I mean, you don't do this, but the really contentious debates that go on. Like the one thing that I really don't like, that I just tune out basically at this point, is there is something, it's not really about the commercial side as much as it is like, I think there's also this intensely sort of masculine, I want to almost call it like nerdy intellectual thing, where there's a lot of guys like sitting around talking about theories and techniques, and especially in traditional astrology.
Yeah.
um, and like it just sort of becomes like I could, if when I was participating in these forums, I might be having a debate with someone about a minor fixed star and some person from Bosnia for like half a day. Like, what am I doing with my, like, who
Yeah.
cares?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's a place to tread lightly for sure, because not one astrologer is in the same space, and I think ultimately it's a really personal practice also. So when you come to sharing, and I learned the hard way with this too, sharing some ideas, some passing thoughts on Facebook, then it can create a lot of drama for no reason.
yeah, the other thing, going back to this idea of sacrifice, and that's really important. And it's also important for young astrologers, because astrology, as it's becoming more popular and stuff like that, and people are looking at it as a viable, holistic industry or something, um, it's important to remember that for thousands of years, the way to astrology, to astrology as a spiritual path, regardless of what happens with it commercially, the way to astrology, the inner sanctum of astrology, or to allow it to come into your inner sanctuary, uh, has involved sacrifice, as have all forms of divination. The sacrifice doesn't have to be a calf, but was one of my teachers said, um, there should be some sense of sacrificing something, and that should be perpetual. So there should be some perpetual feeling of the need to sacrifice something around the practice, because the real benefit of astrology for those who are consuming it, but for those who practice it maybe even more, is the study itself. It's not what is going to happen to you in the future, what's happened to you in the past. It's the ability to be in the world and have the language of astrology really flow into you. And to do that, you really, the thing about creating ritual space, the knife image of carving out a space, a sanctuary, and to have to keep doing that, to keep sweeping the floors of that space, um, and keep that a clean, beautiful space, so that the real juice of astrology can flow in and be of spiritual benefit. I think that your setting in particular is really important to that process. Like that, your story is a really good reminder that I don't know one successful astrologer that for example, that I really like, that doesn't have a really interesting part of their story where a huge amount of their life was absorbed into this, and they didn't know what was going to come out of it. They didn't know what the reward would be, but they needed to do it. They felt compelled to do it.
Yeah, I think when you say like sweeping the floor constantly and stuff, I think for me, the reflection I've had with this is always keeping my ego in check. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Where is power? Am I always taking, you know, because when you have astrology, when you speak the language, you have a lot of power in client setting and stuff. It gives you an edge, because perhaps we have a sort of understanding of bigger waves, bigger trends. We can understand people. And so always returning up to, why am I doing what I'm doing? Am I doing this because I want to be in a position of power? Am I doing this completely disinterested? And that needs to happen constantly, because obviously the human reptile brain takes over often, depending on circumstance, depending on personalities, whether it's with other astrologers or in client context. And then we get puffed up because we know some
Right.
things,
Yeah,
you
I
know?
know something now.
And
Right.
and so always sort of returning to, why am I doing what I'm doing? Am I trying to broadcast myself on all four winds on social media because I'm trying to, I have my own personal agenda, or is this serving astrology and knowledge and sharing?
Mhm.
And I have to constantly return. So that's sort of my floor sweeping for myself.
Yeah.
Returning to power dynamics with clients, also just constantly sort of, where am I situated? Where is power? And always remembering, that like, am I serving my personal agenda? Where am I coming from with my astrology right now?
Mhm. Yeah, that's really nice. And that's not easy to do. Like that takes some degree of reflectiveness. And I think I personally believe that it's impossible to access that kind of reflectiveness and do that kind of sweeping up around our own egos, so to speak, unless we have some space in which to become quiet, receptive, to listen, to meditate, whatever it might be. And so it also seems to me like you say, is it fair to say that your ability to keep doing that is tied into the need to have these kinds of rhythms in your life?
Yeah, 100%. Also, I think in the era of social media, it's so easy to fall in this loop, especially when you're producing content. Why are you producing content? Are you trying to generate money, or are you trying to get applause, or so always sort of going back to questioning, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I on social media in the first place if I'm completely disinterested and only want to study astrology? Then I
Right.
don't need to be on social media at all. Why am I putting content out there?
Right.
So I always have to sort of situate myself as an astrologer and go back to why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Right. And I think it goes back also, just on some level, it goes back to the thing about compromise. I've had to think about this a lot. Obviously, again, my wife and I owning a yoga studio for a long time, there are decisions that we make regularly that are about money and business. And then outreach or marketing. And then there is the attempt to make sure that um, those maneuvers or like business strategies are in line with something that you're offering that feel like it's a real
Genuine.
substantive. Yeah, it's really authentic. And I think that middle ground is that's a really difficult place to walk. And for me, it's the past 2 years I've gone to India, and when I go to India and I see a lot of astrologers in India are living simple. A lot that their lifestyle is a lot simpler. Because I've had opportunity now to meet quite a few astrologers in India, and they've helped me to pare back. Like in the past year, I've some things have grown. I think I mentioned when we were speaking not long ago that YouTube has become a more effective means of sharing my work than Facebook any longer. Um, but some things have grown. I've also had to cut back on things because the place that I started as an astrologer has changed radically due to the pressures of life, like kids and family and stuff. And I was doing so many readings per day, and it was just really turning into a bottom line. Like I got a mortgage to pay or whatever. And um, it, cutting back now it's been really difficult, and to take that kind of leap of like I don't have to work all the time. And this is part reflected in my own chart too. It's my Capricorn stuff in my chart. But it's really, really hard to make that choice. And yet I think it's something that we need to protect too, is like, because the more in my opinion, it's like things are inevitably going to be a little mixed. But if you don't have space to return to the love of what you're doing for the right reasons is really not that connected to the bottom line of business and all of that, you lose your love for it, you know?
Yeah, and especially so I think philosophically the fact that we're dealing with fate, um, it's obviously, yeah, like life happens and you need to pay bills and stuff like that, and I'm totally for it. But I think ultimately philosophically for me, because I'm handling people's fate, there's something about it where I really need to be in that space. I need to be present in what I'm doing because of it, because what you say can have such an impact. So
Of
it's
course,
important to
right.
actually be aware of what you're doing. And it's so easy to get swept up by the tide. The rhythm of society is so much faster than our natural rhythm, and allowing yourself rest and contemplation, like we feel bad, we feel guilty because we're not productive. And that's a
Yeah.
symptom, such a strong symptom of the current system. We're like, okay, I'm sitting down and I'm not being productive for a whole day. Like, would you ever be able to do that?
Right.
uh,
Right.
ooh, but then again, if you actually take another step back and we look at the actual business of this life and this society, and let's say, what is this business? Okay, we go to the grocery store and most of the stuff being produced is poisonous to us. So this business is actually not even meaningful.
Right.
And so you have to return to yourself and be like, yeah, okay, the rhythm and the tide I'm being swept in is actually a business that is destructive.
That's right. Yeah, that's the, of course, the the, in bhakti, which is what I've been really interested in for a number of years now. We say that basically the modes of material nature, that's one of the kind of phrases that is used in the Gita, like the mode of rajas, which is passion, is like that. It tastes good in the beginning, but it feels awful coming out. And so, but because we tend to stay at the head of that process, wanting the taste that feels good, the taste that feels good, and we tend to ignore the way that it comes out and feels awful as it comes out, the ramifications or consequences. We stay stuck in this cycle of passionate consuming, and the
So with
biggest
that, oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
well, the
Sorry.
biggest leap of faith is sort of found in saying, I believe that by not being productive, I might actually be happier.
Yeah, well, that's the whole sadhu in India too. Also, it's just this simplicity. The more simple you are, the less you are actually creating garbage.
Yeah, yeah.
uh, um, but so in Bhakti, or the principles you were talking about, do they actually go back to Rahu, or the North Node?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course. Rahu would be really Rajistic.
Materialistic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because obviously I'm talking about all these beautiful principles and stuff like that, but it's something I struggle myself with. I have the North Node conjunct Venus, um, and it's the ruler of both my sun and moon. So I definitely have this materialistic aspect, and I think we all have these. We wouldn't be here experiencing existence, material reality, if we didn't have to confront these things. But I think having a spiritual practice helps you sort of go back and recenter.
That's really nicely said. Yeah. It makes me, by the way, just on the Rahu point for a second, and then I want to show people your website. I can't help but sometimes just be like, the classical idea of the North Node, even in the West, was that it was Jupiterian in both potentially sort of seemingly good and sort of bad ways, but it was related to increase, you know what I mean, and appetite in the West
Mm-hmm.
and in the East. And they saw it in the East more specifically linked to material desire. I just can't help but think of what an irony that is when you consider how much the symbol of spiritual growth the North Node has been projected to be in some modern astrology circles. Sometimes I just like, I
Because
have
we
to like,
are we are in the cult of materialism here in
right.
the
So
West.
everyone
That's
says,
all.
so for people who don't know what I'm talking about, A lot of evolutionary astrologers say you're supposed to go toward your north node. You're supposed to become your north node, like that. And in some ways, in ancient astrology, that's akin to saying something like you should become what you desire. And that's potentially really problematic from a more traditional standpoint. So there are different views, and I'm not saying, but it's
But
interesting to consider.
when you study the traditional Vedic literature on the South Node, it's a much more enlightenment point, because it's a point of spiritualization.
Yeah,
and
that's
a,
right.
and so yeah, I like to think of them as batteries. They work together.
Yeah. Okay. Before we go off crazy into node land, I just had to mention that. So I want to show people your website. We'll wrap up here. So I'm going to share your website on the screen so that everybody can see it. Ninth House Astrology is where you can find Elodie. She has consultations. You can learn more about her. You can contact her. I hope that you guys will check it out. Is there anything that people should know about Elodie?
I'm mentoring privately right now, but I will eventually be teaching, so I have that in the works. And also, I'm going to be lecturing in Halifax at a conference in September here for Canadian on the East Coast listening. There's a small astrology conference happening in Halifax, and that will be announced too a little bit later.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yep.
So it's ninth
Thank you so
house.
much.
Just so I get the website right, it's ninthhouseastrology.wordpress.com.
Yeah, or you could just do .com and it will come
Oh,
up.
it's okay. Just
Yeah.
ninthhouseastrology.com with a
Yep.
9 at the top. So I'll put that in the YouTube link as well. Yeah, Elodie, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad, because I want other people out there who are astrologers, who are thinking about astrology, to hear the stories of astrologers who are, devoting their lives to astrology, who have developed practices on some level, and to hear what I consider to be the very diverse and rich backgrounds that lead to someone giving their life to astrology on some level. So thank you so much for being here and just sharing your story with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I like this project a lot.
Yeah, I think it's cool. And if you hear of anyone that you think would have a good story, obviously let me know, because I love.
Sounds good.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we will see you all next time. Hopefully we'll have another interesting story to tell sometime soon. Okay, take care everyone. Bye.